Look at the box sitting in your living room right now. Your phone, your shoes, the coffee maker on your counter. Almost none of it was made where you live, and almost all of it crossed an ocean inside a steel box you never saw, on a ship you never heard of, owned by a company you cannot name. You live inside a system that moves 90% of everything you own, and you have almost no idea how it actually works. Here is the strange part. You would think a system this important would be controlled by governments, or by thousands of competing companies the way a normal market works. It is not. A small number of shipping alliances, fewer than you could count on two hands, decide which ports get served, which goods move quickly, and which goods sit waiting. Ask most economists why gas prices spike, and they will talk about oil. Ask why your sofa took 4 months to arrive during a supply crunch, and they will say COVID. Both answers are true. Neither is complete. The real explanation sits underneath, in an industry most people can name, but few can explain. So here is the mystery. Why does the price of shipping a container from Shanghai to Los Angeles sometimes cost $2,000 and other times $20,000 for the exact same box, the exact same ship, the exact same distance? Why did a single stuck ship in the Suez Canal delay billions of dollars of goods for a week? And why do a handful of shipping alliances, not governments, effectively decide how fast your economy moves? To understand this, you need to go back to a welder in North Carolina named Malcolm McLean. In 1956, cargo was loaded onto ships one crate at a time, by hand, by dock workers who spent days packing odd-shaped boxes into a hold. It was slow, expensive, and dangerous. McLean had a simple idea. What if every piece of cargo lived inside a standardized steel box? A box that could move from a truck, to a crane, to a ship, to another truck, without ever being opened. No repacking, no wasted space, no wasted time. It sounds obvious now. It was not obvious then. McLean had to fight ports, unions, and an entire industry built around manual labor. But once the standardized container caught on, something happened that nobody fully predicted. The cost of moving goods across an ocean collapsed. Economists later calculated that containerization cut shipping costs by more than 90% over the following decades. And when the cost of moving something across the planet drops that far, the entire logic of manufacturing changes. Before the container, it made sense to build your factory close to your customers. After the container, it made sense to build your factory wherever labor was cheapest and ship the finished product anywhere in the world for pennies. This single steel box is a large part of why your shirt is stitched in Bangladesh, your phone is assembled in China, and your car's wiring harness might come from Mexico. The container did not just move goods, it rearranged the entire map of global manufacturing. Notice what that means for a country like China. Its rise as the world's factory floor was not simply a story about cheap labor. Cheap labor had existed in plenty of places for a long time. What changed was that, for the first time, a factory in Shenzhen could ship a finished product to a customer in Ohio for only slightly more than a factory in Ohio itself would have paid to ship it across town. Once that gap closed, the decision to manufacture overseas stopped being a difficult trade-off and became, for many companies, simply obvious. But here is where the story gets interesting, because a shipping container by itself explains nothing about why an industry built on cheap, standardized boxes ended up dominated by so few players. To understand that, you have to look at what shipping actually costs to run. A container ship is not like a taxi. You cannot simply build one when demand rises and sell it when demand falls. A modern container ship can cost over $150 million, takes years to construct, and remains useful for 20 to 30 years. Once you commit that kind of capital, you are locked into a business with enormous fixed costs and painfully slow flexibility. Economists call this a natural oligopoly. When an industry requires massive upfront investment, but the marginal cost of carrying one more container is nearly zero, the market naturally consolidates into a handful of giants who can absorb the risk that smaller companies cannot. That consolidation accelerated hard after 2008. The financial crisis crushed global trade volumes just as shipping companies had ordered a wave of new megaships betting on continued growth. Suddenly, there was far more shipping capacity than cargo to fill it. Freight rates collapsed. Dozens of mid-sized carriers went bankrupt or were swallowed by larger rivals. By the time the dust settled, the survivors did something that should sound familiar if you have ever studied airlines or telecom companies facing the same brutal economics. They stopped competing head-to-head and started cooperating. Today, roughly 80% of global container shipping capacity flows through three alliances. 2M, led by Maersk and MSC. Ocean Alliance, anchored by CMA, CGM, and COSCO. And the Alliance, built around Hapag-Lloyd and One. These are not simple partnerships. Competing companies share ships, share routes, and coordinate schedules, while technically remaining separate businesses that still compete on price. It is a strange hybrid, cooperation and competition running in the same vessel at the same time. Why would fierce competitors willingly share their most expensive assets with each other? Because no single company, not even Maersk, can profitably serve every major trade route alone. By pooling ships, alliances can offer more frequent departures, more port coverage, and lower costs per container than any one carrier could manage independently. For the shipping lines, it is survival. For the rest of the world, it means the flow of nearly all global trade now depends on decisions made inside a small number of boardrooms. This is where the hidden incentive structure starts to explain the headlines you have actually seen. Take the 2021 supply chain crisis. Demand for physical goods spiked as people stuck at home bought furniture, electronics, and exercise equipment instead of spending on travel and restaurants. Ports in Los Angeles and Long Beach, which together handle roughly 40% of American containerized imports, became jammed with more ships than the docks could unload. Container ships sat anchored offshore for weeks. And because so much shipping capacity is concentrated inside just three alliances, there was no reserve fleet of independent carriers to absorb the overflow. The system had been optimized for efficiency during normal times, which is precisely what made it fragile during an abnormal one. Spot freight rates from Shanghai to Los Angeles, which typically sat around $2,000 per container, spiked past $20,000 at the peak. That is not a story about a single broken supply chain. That is the direct fingerprint of an industry with almost no spare capacity, run by a handful of coordinating giants hit by a demand shock nobody had modeled. Now consider the Ever Given, the container ship that wedged itself sideways across the Suez Canal in March 2021. A single vessel, roughly the length of the Empire State Building tipped on its side, blocked one of the busiest shipping corridors on Earth for 6 days. Nearly 12% of global trade passes through that canal. The blockage delayed an estimated $10 billion of goods every single day it remained stuck. One ship, one canal. A meaningful fraction of the planet's economy paused. Why does one physical choke point carry that much power? Because the alternative route, around the Cape of Good Hope at the southern tip of Africa, adds roughly 2 weeks to the journey and burns significantly more fuel. Shipping companies do not build in that kind of slack as a matter of course, because slack costs money in an industry already fighting thin margins. The entire global economy runs remarkably close to its structural limits, and it takes surprisingly little to expose exactly how little cushion exists. There is another layer to this story that rarely makes headlines, and it lives in the flag painted on the back of every container ship. Walk down to almost any major port and look at the ships lined up waiting to unload. Many of them fly the flag of Panama, Liberia, or the Marshall Islands. None of those countries built the ship, own the ship, or employ most of the crew. They simply offer what the industry calls a flag of convenience, registering foreign vessels in exchange for a fee, lighter taxation, and looser labor regulation than the ship's actual owners would face at home. Panama alone has more ships registered under its flag than the entire United States merchant fleet, despite owning almost none of them itself. Why would a shipping company based in Denmark or France choose a flag from a country it has never operated in? because registering under a flag of convenience can mean lower crew wages, fewer safety inspections, and reduced corporate taxes, all while the ship still sails wherever the owner's cargo needs to go. It is a quiet form of regulatory arbitrage, one industry veterans have used for nearly a century, and it means the rules governing labor conditions, safety standards, and environmental compliance on the ship carrying your sofa were often written by a government with no ships of its own, competing for registration fees against dozens of other small nations doing exactly the same thing. This pattern repeats far beyond shipping lanes. Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company produces the vast majority of the world's most advanced computer chips from a handful of factories on one island. A small number of rare earth processing facilities in China supply materials essential to electric vehicles, wind turbines, and military hardware. Modern globalization did not simply spread production around the world. It concentrated critical stages of production into an unusually small number of choke points, each one capable of disrupting industries that appear on the surface to have nothing to do with shipping or semiconductors or rare earth minerals at all. Economists have a name for the underlying trade-off. It is the tension between efficiency and resilience. A system optimized purely for lowest cost with no redundancy performs beautifully when nothing goes wrong. The moment something does go wrong, a single failure ripples outward with almost no buffer to absorb the shock. For decades, businesses optimized almost entirely for efficiency because redundancy is expensive and shareholders reward companies for cutting costs, not for hoarding backup capacity nobody asked for. The pandemic, the Suez blockage, and the trade tensions of recent years forced a slow and expensive rethink. Companies began talking about resilience instead of pure efficiency. Some manufacturers started reshoring, moving production closer to consumers. Others pursued what is sometimes called friendshoring, shifting supply chains toward politically aligned countries rather than simply the cheapest available labor. None of this reverses containerization or eliminates shipping alliances. It simply acknowledges a truth those earlier decades of relentless cost-cutting had quietly ignored. A system this concentrated is only stable until the day it is not. There is a second front in this story, and it is fought not at sea, but on the docks themselves. Ports like Rotterdam and Singapore have spent billions automating cranes, gates, and container yards, replacing manual labor with software that can track thousands of boxes simultaneously and route them without a human dispatcher. Automation raises throughput and cuts costs for terminal operators, which sounds like an unambiguous win, but it has also triggered some of the most contentious labor disputes in the modern economy. Dockworker unions in the United States and Europe have repeatedly threatened and occasionally carried out strikes over automation, arguing that a handful of shipping conglomerates should not be allowed to eliminate thousands of jobs simply because a machine can move a container a few seconds faster. The tension is not really about technology. It is about who captures the savings when an industry this concentrated gets even more efficient, the workers who move the cargo or the alliances who own the ships. What happens next matters more than it might first appear. Shipping companies are now racing to decarbonize, testing methanol and ammonia-powered vessels to meet tightening international emissions targets, while geopolitical tension between the United States and China is quietly rerouting entire trade lanes away from the shortest path and toward the safest one. Houthi attacks on vessels in the Red Sea forced many carriers to abandon the Suez Canal entirely in 2024, rerouting around Africa despite the extra cost, proof that the industry's choke points are not only physical, but political. Every one of these shifts, the fuel switch, the rerouted lane, the automated crane, reinforces the same underlying truth. A small number of decision-makers sitting inside shipping alliances, port authorities, and a handful of governments willing to rent out a flag continue to shape how quickly and cheaply the modern world can move. So who actually benefits from a shipping industry this consolidated? The alliances themselves clearly do, capturing enormous profits during boom years like 2021, when Maersk alone reported tens of billions of dollars in profit, more than the company had earned across the entire previous decade. Combined, consumers benefit during normal times, paying remarkably little to move goods across oceans. But when disruption hits, it is consumers and smaller businesses who absorb the cost through higher prices, empty shelves, and delayed shipments, while the handful of dominant carriers often profit even more from the very chaos that hurts everyone else. And who pays the long-term cost of this arrangement? Perhaps the countries and companies that assume cheap, reliable shipping would always exist. The just-in-time manufacturing model, which minimizes inventory and relies on goods arriving exactly when needed, was built for a world where container ships almost never got stuck, where alliances almost never ran short of capacity, and where a functioning choke point was simply assumed rather than questioned. That assumption held for decades. It is being tested now, which brings you back to that box in your living room. It arrived because a welder from North Carolina solved a packing problem in 1956. It arrived cheaply because an entire industry consolidated into a handful of alliances built to survive brutal, capital-intensive economics. And it arrived on time, or did not, depending on whether a canal stayed open, a port stayed uncongested, and an industry with almost no spare capacity happened to have enough that particular week. You do not usually think about any of this when you unbox something you ordered online. You were never supposed to. The entire system was built to make global trade feel invisible, instantaneous, and effortless. But underneath that invisibility sits one of the most concentrated, fragile, and quietly powerful arrangements in the modern economy, one where a handful of companies, not governments, decide how fast the world moves. The next time a delivery is late, you will know it is rarely a simple story about a stuck ship. It is the visible edge of a system engineered for efficiency, and only now beginning to reckon with what that efficiency actually costs.